Hi, I'm Dr. Jeffrey Emge from the University of Texas at Tyler, and these videos will be my teaching series on the 2023 All-Region Etudes for Oboe, for TMEA. So let's take a look today at Etude number 16 first. It's very difficult. It's 32 measures and it's full of 16th notes, lots of arpeggios, lots of tricky articulations. For part one of this series, we're going to be looking at the first two lines, measures 1 through 8. So let's get started. Now that we've heard measures 1 through 8, let's take a look at the nuts and bolts as to how to practice it and prepare those 8 measures. The first step is taking a look at the altissimo notes that are used in the first 8 bars, and they are high C sharp and high D. The standard fingerings for those two notes are C sharp, second and third fingers of the left hand, index finger of the right hand, and the low C key. For the high D, the standard fingering when tongued is half hole 2-3, middle finger right hand, low C key. If you have to slur up to the high D, some of you, because of your reed, your experience, your instrument, you may have to slur up to the high D with the half hole lifted. Those are the standard fingerings for those two altissimo notes. Now let's take a look at the vocabulary that we need for this etude. Most of it is the B minor scale. And you will have to know, for this etude, you'll have to know from low B natural, B3, up to high E6. That's quite a range. So let's review the scale. You should practice it on your own, slurred and tongued. Of course, there are two other forms to the minor, the harmonic and the melodic. But this form is the one that will be used the most. So practice the B natural minor scale first, slurred and tongued. Normally in the all-region etudes, there are a lot of problems with counting and rhythms. In this etude, the rhythms are all 16th notes. But I do want to call your attention to the end of measure 8 because there's only an 8th rest there, and we'll count it like this. 1E and a 2E and a 3E, 1. You'll notice it's not much of a chance to breathe. I guarantee that folks who don't take private lessons or are not careful will take at least twice as long to breathe at the end of measure 8. So be careful with those 8th rests. We'll see one just like it again later. Many times for the all-region etudes, finding a good place to breathe or choosing phrasing will be difficult. In measures 1 through 8, it's not very difficult. There's no place to breathe or bail out. For the performance, you will have to play measures 1 through 8 in one breath. It will be expected. But for practice at a slow speed, I suggest you play measures 1 through 5 first note in one breath, and then go back and continue from there. That's not how you'll perform it, but when you're learning it at a slow tempo, probably a good idea to divide these 8 measures up into 2 sections. Now let's take a look at a basic way to learn the technical aspects of these 8 measures. The first step would be to play one measure at a time using a metronome, and I have a metronome here with me, and I'm going to choose a nice slow tempo. Don't freak out, that's the 8th note I'll be using. And like 1E and a 2E and a, so pretty slow. We'll go back and play one measure at a time. You could even slur them all if you want. The idea being to just play relaxed, as slow as you need to, 1 bar plus a note. You'll notice the first 2 bars are nothing but a B minor arpeggio. And then we'll take a look at the chromatic scale in measure 3. you'll notice it was written not in the best way. It's descending, but written with a bunch of sharps and naturals. Now let's take a look at measures 3 and 4, which we want to practice in 4 note groups. Those of you that have had music theory in the past will recognize this is B melodic minor through this passage. Notice the articulations as well as the chromatics. Now we have the little chromatic lick coming up in measure 5. F sharp major arpeggio in 5. Another chromatic lick in measure 6. Another arpeggio. Look at all the marks I've made in measure 7. You'll be practicing measure 7 many, many, many times. Take one arpeggio at a time and go very slowly until you're confident with the fingers. Please note, the footnote at the bottom of the etude mentions to play C sharp in the staff open. There is no such note on the modern oboe. Don't do that. Use the standard fingering, please, for C sharp. Once you have mastered roughly one measure at a time, play 2 measures at a time with a metronome. Then 4 measures, and finally work your way up gradually to playing the entire 8-measure excerpt. The next step in learning measures 1 through 8 is looking for opportunities to shape phrases, add a small amount of dynamic variety not written in the music. The first place we'll look is measure 5, where it will be a good idea to add a small crescendo. At the end of measure 6, we can add a small diminuendo. At the end of measure 7, add another small crescendo. And then finally, end measure 8 with a slight decrescendo. When you first start practicing this etude, don't get ahead of yourself. Pace yourself by starting slowly. Start at 8th note, 100 to 120. A comfortable, slow speed that will allow you to relax your fingers and perfect the technique. Only go faster when you're comfortable playing all 8 measures at a given tempo. There are a lot of arpeggios in this excerpt. Let's take a look at the first one. Measures 1 and 2, the B minor arpeggio. Wow, that's a long arpeggio. Now let's look at measure 3, a chromatic scale descending from B down to F sharp. Now we come to the most difficult part. Measure 7 starts with the F sharp major arpeggio, and then we have what's called a C sharp dominant 7 arpeggio. Just the name itself is awkward, right? And look at my suggested fingers for left and right. Some of you may choose to use E sharp with forked F, E sharp of course being natural, F natural, and you can do that if you like. It's going to be slightly out of tune, but at a fast speed, probably no one will know. So either way, C sharp, forked F, or C sharp, left F. And finally, measure 8, F sharp major arpeggio. I just want to warn you, you're going to be spending most of your time of the first half of this etude practicing measures 7 and 8. Get used to drilling it as a daily drill. In regards to articulation, there are a lot of staccato markings you've noticed. Don't make too much of the staccato. Instead, think of light tongue, because at a fast speed, it would be almost impossible for a listener to tell the difference between legato and staccato. In fact, let me demonstrate that. I'm going to play measure 2 with the tongue notes legato. Now I'm going to play measure 2 with the tongue notes staccato. As you can see, there's not much difference, and I'm not even playing it right now at what I would consider performance tempo. Go easy on the articulation, think light tongue instead of short. Now, the other articulation issue that we should mention at this stage is that many of the tonguing and slurring patterns get mixed up in the middle. Measures 4 and 5, for example, measures 7 and 8. At your initial practice, go very slowly and make sure at first you're playing the correct articulations. If you find out later you've been playing them wrong, you know by now it's going to be very difficult to change. Let's talk for a moment about building tone quality and intonation. Since this etude is in the key of B minor, most of the time you should set a tuning device that has an audible note. I've got one here in front of me. This is the B in the middle of the treble clef. Make sure you can match it. Then compare the octave. Finally, play the scale slowly with the tuner on. I'll turn the volume up just a little bit for this reason. Change your tuner to F sharp. Compare the octaves. Finally, before you play the etude as a whole, or any section of the etude as a whole, go back and play long tones until you feel relaxed and comfortable, so that when you start moving your fingers, your face, your airstream are still going to be thinking long tones. At the audition, you are allowed to play one note before you perform the etude. Since this is in the key of B minor, choose B natural. That will be your best note to get you started. Journal your progress starting with the very beginning of your practice sessions. Keep a record of what you perform each day, what tempos you use, and just as important, how you felt about the performance. Did you feel like you got a lot done? Were you frustrated? If so, why? The journal will serve two functions. It will be both a record of your progress and something for you to look back on in November and December with pride as to how much progress you've made toward the audition. The audition process takes several months of practice, and I urge you, practice every day with the metronome and keep the long-term goal of focus. Good luck. Hello and welcome to Part 2 of Etude number 16 in B minor, one of the etudes for oboe for the TMEA All-Region Auditions 2023. This is a very difficult etude. It's 32 measures, full of 16th notes. It's about 275 notes altogether in this etude. And it lasts about just over a minute. We're going to be focusing today on measures 9 through 16, the second part of the etude. Before we get into the nuts and bolts of the rhythms and the notes and the technique, we need to do a little bit of review. First of all, the altissimo notes. C sharp 6 and D6 and E6. High C sharp has a unique fingering and it's pretty standard for all oboes. Left hand 2-3, right hand first finger and the low C key. Now, high D is a slightly more tricky issue. The standard fingering for high D is half hole, 2-3, right hand, middle finger, and low C key. Some oboes do not slur to high D very well. In that case, you might want to consider slurring up to it by lifting the half whole key. Now we have E6, the trickiest one of all. The standard fingering looks something like this: octave key, half whole, 2-3, A flat key left hand, 2-3 right hand. Pause the video if you want to take a photograph or study it. However, we are slurring to the high E in this part of the etude, and we're slurring by big leap. So you might want to consider this fingering if it allows your high E to speak better on slur. The same fingering I just showed you, except the half hole is lifted. Coincidentally, that's the one I'm using myself for this part of the etude. Part of the review we're going to do before we actually get into playing this section of the etude is checking the vocabulary. The B minor scale, and the range goes all the way from low B up to high E. So let's review that now. 2 sharps starting on low B. Let's look for a moment at phrasing and breathing. Now, of course, when you do the audition, you're going to play all 8 of these measures in one breath. But as you begin to learn the etude, that's probably not possible. So let's give you a place to breathe in the middle that seems logical. Let's look at measure 12, the third beat after the B natural, the very first note of B3. Now, at your initial stage of practice, that would sound like this. Here's measure 12. The G, A, B at the end of measure 12 is a pickup note or series of pickup notes to measure 13. So it's best to breathe right before it. Again, take a very deep breath at the end of measure 8 so that you're going to be able to play 9 through 16 all in one breath at the audition. Our final part of the preparation for the practice is a review of the arpeggios, and there are quite a few of them. The most important one, of course, is B minor, and we find that in measures 9 and 16. So let's review the B minor arpeggio. And let's review the G major arpeggio, which is used in measures 10 through 12. Now the C major arpeggio, which is used in measure 13. Now a very bizarre one in measure 14, the A sharp diminished 7. Now, if you've not had theory, that probably just kind of goes right over your head. But it is 4 notes, A sharp, C sharp, E, G. And you look at measure 14, I've marked it for you with a little degree sign meaning diminished. And you'll notice it's very awkward fingerings. You'll want to practice that up and down several times before you put in the articulations as marked. Finally, we have what's called an F sharp dominant 7 arpeggio at the end of measure 15. You'll notice F sharp, E, C sharp, A sharp. That's pretty awkward. And you can tell by the circled note, I had a little trouble early on in my practice missing that pitch. Okay, so we've reviewed the scale, arpeggios, phrasing and breathing. Let's look at the technique and sequencing of technique. Basically, we will work one measure at a time, slowly, and add one note at the end. So for example, let's take a look at measure number 10. Measure number 10 will be done like this. Don't even need to add dynamics at first. Just play at a comfortable mezzo piano or mezzo forte. You want to make sure you're playing the correct articulations. The rhythm itself, of course, is not a problem. You will go through and work one measure plus a note at a time. Once you're comfortable playing one measure at a time, go back and play 2 measures at a time. then 4 measures at a time. Finally, the entire 8-measure segment. Practice with a metronome. It doesn't matter how slow you go at first, but it will keep you consistent and honest in the speed of the 16th notes. Many of the Ferling etudes have only a few dynamic markings. This section of the etude, however, has quite a bit of detail. I would make one suggestion to you. Let's look at measure 16. You've been playing loud and very loud most of this section of the etude. Probably it's a good idea to add a diminuendo at the end of the measure, like this. Just a little diminuendo gives a nice taper to the end of the phrase. As you begin your practice, your initial tempo goal should be to practice slowly. Set your metronome, depending on your ability and experience, to somewhere between 100 and 120. Now that's not going to be the quarter note, that's going to be the 8th note speed. So for example, at 120, ba-dee-dee-ah-da-hee-dee-ah-da-hee-dee-ah-da. That's very reasonable to start learning one measure at a time. Journal your tempos as you slowly increase speed and keep consistent the tempos you work at. If you find one measure is tougher for you, don't play faster on the other measures until you can catch up with that difficult technical measure. At the audition, probably most people who make all region are going to be playing at about 80 to 90 beats a minute. So that's where you're headed long term throughout the fall semester. There are a lot of articulation issues in this etude. Let's look first of all at slurring in pairs, which happens in measures 9, 10, 11, 13, and 14. And you might want to practice those measures separately once or twice a day, just so you recognize that there's a consistency in articulation. Of course, there are several measures that are marked with slur 3, tongue 1. Dee-ah-ha, dee-dee-ah-ha. One of the tricks I learned from playing jazz saxophone for many years was that one of my professors said, if you can say it, you can play it. And I will go back in practice if I'm having trouble with articulation and just say the articulations so I can focus on that only. So for example, measures 9 and 10 might be performed like this. Dee-ah, dee-ah, da-ah, dee-ah, da-ah, dee-ah, dee-ah, dee-dee-ah, dee-dee-da, da-da. You'll notice, example, measure 10, the articulation gets mixed up. That happens a lot. Try to look for patterns. When do articulations change, and are there any places that are unique, not repeated articulations in that section? Now let's look at some steps to build tone quality and improve intonation. This section is in B minor, so let's first tune our B, B4, the one in the middle of the staff. Then find a tone generator, something that can play the B, and listen to it and match it. Once you've done that, compare that with the upper octave. Now do the same thing with half whole D. Play with a tuner. Tone generator. Match pitch. Finally, compare octaves. Once you've worked on the intonation for those notes, go back and just play long tones and listen to the quality of your sound, add a little vibrato. Remember that while you are playing an etude, your breath, your throat, your oral cavity should continue to play a long tone. You just happen to be moving your fingers and your tongue. Please keep in mind that I'm available both for lessons. You can contact me at the email address given, and possible Zoom coaching as well. The All-Region Etudes this year are very difficult, and you'll need to practice throughout the fall. I urge you to practice only with a metronome and a tuner present. This is the end of Etude number 16, Part 2. Welcome back. This is Part 3 of my series of videos covering the practice and learning of the All-Region Etudes for Oboe for TMEA All-Region Auditions 2023. Etude number 16 in B minor is 32 measures long, and we're covering today measures 17 through 24. All of it is in the key of B minor. So let's hear the third part, measures 17 through 24. All right, so before we get into the details of the rhythms and notes and patterns, let's review the altissimo notes that are necessary to play this section of the etude: C sharp, high D, and high E. So the first thing we're going to look at is high C sharp. High C sharp, the standard fingering, left hand 2, 3, right hand index finger and the low C key. High D, the standard fingering is the half hole, 2, 3 of the left hand, right hand, middle finger, and the low C key. Now comes the high E. For many of you, this fingering will work very, very well. It is octave key in the back, half hole 2, 3, A flat key, and 2 and 3 in the front. If you have a third octave key, you may wish to use that here to bring the pitch up. Other people will be taught, depending on your oboe and your reed, to use both the A flat key and the left E flat key. Either of those fingerings that work, that's the one you should stick with. Let's talk briefly about phrasing and breathing. Now, of course, at the audition, you will be expected to play all 8 measures in one breath. But for slow practice, there's a great place to take a quick breath, and that is at measure 21 after the first note, that E sharp. So it would sound something like this in slow practice. That's perfectly okay for slow practice until you can get the tempo faster. Now here comes the slightly more difficult part, all the arpeggios that have to be used in this excerpt. Let's start with measure 17. It's an F sharp major chord with a high E at the end. That's pretty difficult. So start with learning the F sharp major arpeggio. Then later you add the E to it. Later you put the slurs in. Measure 18, the B minor arpeggio. So first we learn the notes from the bottom up, B, D, F sharp, starting on low D. Put the slurs in. The next 2 bars, the G major arpeggio, and we're going to learn it 2 octaves starting with the low D. Then play it in order as written. Then in measure 23, we have a strange chord called the E sharp diminished 7. Check that out, E sharp, G sharp, B, D. That's a very, very weird arpeggio. It's going to sound like this. And then playing it in order as measure 23 is written. Now with the repeated notes. Now let's look at a way to learn the technical aspects of this section of the etude. We'll start with the metronome on at a relatively slow speed. Now don't freak out, that is not the quarter note. I'm going to be practicing that to the eighth note. All the practicing I do at a slow speed, I'll turn on the division of the pulse. So the speed we're going to be using is 1E and 2E and of course you can go even slower. I have the metronome set right now to 126 to the eighth note. Now I'm going to look at a measure, let's say 19, and let's work one measure at a time. So I'll play one measure plus a note. And I'll play that many times until I'm very comfortable. Then I'll go back and do two measures plus a note. So let's do 19 and 20, for example. I really make a habit of playing a measure and then the next note, so I don't mentally stop at a bar line. Now, of course, the next step, after I do everything one measure at a time plus a note, two measures plus a note, I'll play half of it. So say 4 measures at a time. So here's 19, 20, 21, 22. Once I can play 4 measures at a time with the metronome, then I will try to do all 8 measures. But be very, very careful you're playing the articulations as you go. It's okay to stop and go back and just say the articulations. For example, measure 19. Dee-ah-ha, dee-dee-ah, dee-dee-ah, dee-da. Just make sure that you're using the correct tonguing pattern. As you know, if you learn articulations wrong initially, it's very difficult to go back and correct them. Now let's look at a couple of places to shape phrases further. Look at measure number 21, where the volume changes suddenly to piano. Add a little bit of a crescendo and diminuendo. It's tough to do at a fast tempo. I did a lot of practice already of the loud music before measure 21 and then just the soft stuff, so I could figure out how I was going to negotiate the contrast. Finally, please note that the last 2 measures, measures 23 and 24, that's a crescendo that really goes all the way to the end. Initially, practice slowly and carefully, setting a metronome to the 8th note at 100. 1E and is not too slow for the initial practice. Even experienced musicians, maybe 120 to the 8th note for the initial practice, is pretty confident and advanced already. After you've learned the material, by the time you get ready for all region, a good tempo, depending on your region and the number of oboe players involved, would be 80 to 90 for the quarter note. Probably for area, 90 to 100. So that's the tempo goal that you should be thinking at each step of the way. Now let's talk articulation. There are a number of staccato markings in here, and they're mostly irrelevant because they occur at the end of the beat, and you're going to be playing this for the audition at a fast tempo. Instead, think about light tonguing. Let's look at the variety of articulation now that's in here. So for example, at measures 17 and 18 and 23, you have slurring in pairs. Dia, 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 dia. At measures 19 and 20, you have slur 3 and tongue 1. Dia, ha, da, dia, ha, da, da. It's perfectly okay to turn on a metronome and just check the articulation. It's fine. Professional musicians do it all the time. Finally, measure 24, you have tongue 1, slur 3. Da, da, ya, da, da, ya. So there's quite a variety of articulation just in those 8 measures. Now some steps to building a good tone quality and improving your intonation. Let's start with a device that generates a tone, and since this section is all in B minor, I'm going to play the note B on my tone generator and match it for pitch. Once I'm confident I'm playing the B in the staff, B4 in tune, now I'll compare it with the octave above. Once we've done that, checked our B's, now let's do the same thing for half whole D, D5. Comparing now with the high octave, which we have in measure 19. Finally, let's go back and play with the tuner the note B with a long tone and a good warm sound. Hear my litany that I tell all students and have them repeat. My fingers may move, but my air plays a long tone. So you want to have that warm, vibrant sound throughout that concept, still face resonant and open oral cavity as you play. This is the end of Etude number 16, part 3. Keep practicing, remember to journal your progress, and good luck in your preparation for the all-region auditions. Welcome to part 4 of the video series dealing with the Etude number 16 in B minor, part of the all-region etudes for 2023 TMEA State of Texas. We'll be looking today at the final 8 measures of Etude number 16. Etude number 16 is very, very difficult. It has 369 notes and 32 measures, and there's a couple places where it's pretty much impossible to take a breath. So it has to be practiced very carefully over a long period of time to learn it. Even if you play the entire etude, it is over in 1 minute and 15 seconds. So it's a lot of notes for that short a time. Let's listen now to the last 8 measures of this etude. Before we get into the nuts and bolts of the mechanics of this part of the etude, let's take a look at some of the background information necessary to be successful. The first of which is a review of the altissimo notes. So we're going to look at the fingerings for high C sharp and high D briefly. High C sharp has a standard fingering: left hand, second and third finger, right hand, first finger, and the low C key. The standard fingering for high D is as follows: half hole, 2, 3 in the left hand, right hand, middle finger, and low C key. Oboes who have trouble slurring up to the high D, there are several little tricks we can learn, the easiest one of which is to slur to the high D by lifting the half hole up. Let's look at the arpeggios necessary to master the technique for this section. The most important one, of course, is B minor, which we're going to see in measures 25, 29, 31, and 32. So we can start on the middle B and go up and down. F sharp major, which is used in measure 27, and you'll see that one as A sharp, C sharp, F sharp, A sharp, C sharp. Now the very strange one at the end, measure 30, A sharp diminished 7. A sharp, C sharp, E, G. That's really ugly. At the beginning, there's a B natural thrown in, which does not belong to the arpeggio. So I'm going to start on G and work our way down. That's pretty awkward, isn't it? And then, of course, there is a B harmonic minor scale that's thrown in measure 27 on the way down. Starts on the high C sharp. You'll notice it's got A sharp followed by G natural. That's unusual. So I've marked it in the music for you. You'll definitely want to mark that. It's not a typical scale we see in an etude. Let's talk for a minute about phrasing and breathing. As I mentioned in part 3 for this etude, it's going to be necessary to take a breath at the end of measure 24. And if you are a person who can hold your breath for an extremely long time and make all 16 measures at the end in one breath, congratulations. But most of us will not be able to do that. That's why I suggested taking a breath at the end of measure 24. When you practice this etude slowly, you're not going to be able to play 8 measures at once. Go ahead and take a breath at the end of measure 28. Now, for the performance, however, you will have to do the last 8 measures all in one breath. No getting around it. Now, let's look at the basic technique and how to practice the technique from the beginning level. The first step is looking at a measure at a time, plus one note, and we'll slur it. So I'm going to set a metronome to a very slow tempo.
1, 2.
That's the 8th note. 1 E and a 2, etc. Now let's practice one measure plus a note with the correct articulation.
1, 2.
Be careful, don't make too much of the staccatos. Next, once you've mastered each measure plus a note and feel comfortable at a very slow tempo, then increase the amount of your playing to 2 measures at a time plus a note.
1, 2.
Finally, combine up to 4 measures at a time plus a note. Always practice with the metronome. Now let's look at some opportunities to shape phrases by adding dynamics. Our first opportunity is measure 28, where we can add a diminuendo. Measures 29 and 30, add a small crescendo, followed by a diminuendo. You'll note in measure 31, there is a double F. It doesn't make sense to suddenly play double F. Instead, use measures 29 and 30 to crescendo to the double F. Finally, take it easy on the last note. No one really wants to hear the oboe play double F on a low B natural. A comfortable sound that's strong is plenty. At the initial practice, set your metronome to 120. No, that's not going to be the quarter note. That'll be the 8th note speed. So you'll hear it 1 E and a, 2 E and a. Don't be afraid to start very slowly until your fingers are comfortable. Over time, gradually increase speed. Good news, there are no major articulation issues in this section. Everything is very logically constructed. Watch out for measure 31. You'll notice you play the low D followed by the B natural. Notice both of those notes are tongued. And then there's a slightly unusual pattern at the end of that measure as well. Now let's look at some ways to improve our intonation awareness and improve tone quality. The first for this section of the etude will be playing the pitch B with the tuner. So I'm going to start with playing it with the tuner. Now I'm going to play it with the tone generator so I can match the pitch listening. Now with the tone generator playing the B third line, let's compare the octaves with the octave above. Now let's set the tone generator to the high C sharp and play the beginning of measure 27. High C sharp is frequently sharp on most oboes and most oboe players. Always think about you're going to have to open up the oral cavity slightly, roll the reed out just a hair, bringing that pitch down. Now let's go back to long tones and work on our vibrato. Since this section is all in B minor, third line B is a good place to start. Play with a good reed that will allow you to have the note speak immediately and a comfortable vibrato. Then go back and play the technical passages with that feeling of relaxation. Remember, vibrato is a natural part of the sound, not something that's flipped on and off as the need arises. Don't forget to journal what you do every practice day. What measures and compositions did you play? What tempos did you use? How did you feel about the performance? The journals serve as an affirmation of your progress and something to have that you can look back on with pride as to your accomplishment. As you no doubt already know, the TMEA all-region auditions are very competitive, held in December each year. There's going to be hundreds of oboe players across the state compete in their various regions. This year, there's one very difficult etude and one moderately easy etude, so the competition will be fairly fierce. Remember, practice every day, use a metronome and a tuner, and stay focused on the long-term goals. Good luck to you.